Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, and this is going to be a response video to a individual user who had some questions regarding end times eschatology, particularly in relation to the recent debacle with Harold Camping, and just wanted a basic summation of the different schools of eschatology out there and how they differ from each other and what the ramifications are with regards to the current political climate here in the United States of America. To begin with, Christian eschatology deals primarily with the prophecies that are put forth in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and the book of Revelation in the New Testament, and they speak to future events that had not yet transpired at the time that these books were penned, but would transpire either in the soon-to-come future or further off in the future. And with this assertion, I have already implied a certain view of eschatology, which I will now refrain from going any further into until I've explained each individual position. Now, like with many different subjects, there are different variables at play, and more than one variable usually applies to a given viewpoint. The first view is a person's view regarding the past, or the things laid out in Scripture itself, and not specifically the things that are held with regards to prophecy. Different people have different views with regards to what the nature of the Bible is and how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to go through these different approaches to prophetic interpretation. These are interpretations that deal specifically with how prophecy relates to the ebb and flow of time. The first of these viewpoints is called preterism, and this is an approach by which prophecy is seen as being fulfilled in the past. And a specific example of this would be the notion that the abomination of desolation that is mentioned specifically in the Gospel is something that has in fact actually occurred, something that occurred in 70 AD when Titus overran Jerusalem and placed a pagan altar in the temple. Now, there are two different schools of preterism. There is partial preterism, which basically argues that there are certain events laid out in Revelation that have already occurred. They were things that were prophesied to occur within the soon aftermath of Christ's ascension into heaven. And then there is another view called full preterism, which argues that everything prophesied in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel have been completely fulfilled, and we are now living in the full sanctified state of Christian civilization. Obviously, you can tell right away that from my description of full preterism that I am not a full preterist. I do accept a form of partial preterism that ties in with the next view that I'm about to give you. This is a completely separate view from preterism, but it does take certain aspects of partial preterism into account, and this is historicism. Historicism specifically states that biblical prophecies provide us with a broad view of history, as well as an explanation of the religious significance of historical events. Basically, it's an attempt to identify prophetic passages with major events in history. Now, the thing to understand is that these particular relationships that major events in history share with biblical prophecy is that there is a margin of error involved in here, and that anybody who accepts a historicist viewpoint is going to be bound to check and recheck his facts in order to make a proper assertion regarding some of these events. And some of these events could very well be tied in with, several events could be tied in with one particular type given in a given prophecy. But the long and short of it is, there is usually a relationship with the ebb and flow of the transcendental views of a given society and how their society will either flourish or decline. And usually you will see a massive decline in the overall cultural status of a given nation before it collapses into an imperialistic model and proceeds to wreak havoc on other nations that are going through different forms of moral decline and are unable to protect themselves. To use the example of World War II, you can see a specific form of cultural backsliding, not just within Germany, but within certain other particular countries in Europe, and these all contributed in various ways to the eventual event that was World War II and the Holocaust. Historicism doesn't necessarily try to attach a singular interpretation of these events, but takes them into account and looks at them in reference to biblical prophecy. That's the extent of historicism. And historicism can differ from one individual to the next. And generally, historicists are a little bit shy about making some real definitive declarations about a given event and its relationship to God's judgment. Some are more bold than others in this assertion, but I generally tend to shy away from doing this too much because there's a lack of certainty in a lot of this. Generally, with futurists, which is the next school of thought I'm going to give, you see a lot more of these sort of wacky assertions that you tend to get out of people like Harold Camping and also Pat Robertson and a few other talking heads on Christian broadcasting. Now, futurism is the third school, and futurism states that there are parallels that may be drawn with historical events, but most eschatological prophecies are chiefly referring to events which have not been fulfilled. So what futurism argues is that almost nothing that is prophesied in the Bible has happened. The destruction of the Hebrew temple in Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the expulsion of the Jews has no relation whatsoever to anything laid out in the book of Revelation or in the book of Daniel whatsoever. And futurism is very heavily tied in with dispensationalism, which I will get into later. It's one of the key ingredients for what accounts for the major viewpoint held among fundamentalists and most so-called mainline evangelical Christians of various stripes that are seen as the quote-unquote Christian right or the moral majority. Now, most prophecies, they argue, are to be fulfilled during a global time of chaos known as the Great Tribulation and afterwards. So you see a lot of talk amongst these people about there being a massive world cataclysm that's supposed to set off the beginning of the end, so to speak, and that's what the Great Tribulation is. Something on a grander scale than most of the wars that we've seen in recent history combined. The fourth school of thought is known as idealism, and it's also known as spiritual or symbolic interpretation. And the events in prophecy are not necessarily past, present, or future, but they're a sort of allegorical representation of ideals and principles that are put forth in biblical teaching. Idealists are generally less prone to try to attribute a specific length or duration of time in between different important events, and they generally tend to look at Christian history from an ahistorical viewpoint outside of the context of Scripture. Most of them view the Bible as having a historic truth to it, but generally idealists tend to view the potential interpretations of the Bible as multifaceted. You can get more than one meaning out of a given passage in the Bible. This form of interpretation was first expounded upon by Thomas Aquinas, but he was arguing it primarily as one particular school of thought amongst others during that period in the medieval church, and that particular viewpoint was not the mainstream viewpoint of Roman Catholicism, or Catholicism I should say, because it is my personal opinion that the Roman Catholic Church did not exist until the Council of Trent, and that the Roman Catholic Church itself broke away from the actual true Catholic Church, which is universal in scope and encompasses all who hold to the tenets of Christian orthodoxy.